Welcome to WJCM video podcast. Special welcome to our guest today, Francois Engelbrecht. Francois is Professor of Climatology and Director of the Global Change Institute here at University of Witwatersrand. Francois, this issue of the journal covers a lot of health-related aspects related to climate change. But our readers will also enjoy is to listen to you discuss some of the true environmental threats that we all face with climate change. And as you well know, following the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC report last year, it was quite sobering. And firstly, maybe you can give us your thoughts what a temperature rise from the current just over 1 to 1.5, maybe even 2 degrees would mean in the next 20, 30 years. And secondly, what it will mean with regards to the 4 major tipping points that you've emphasized in the past.
Thank you, Praveen, for having me today. And I would start in by saying that indeed the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change last year, when it published its 6th assessment report, made a number of very sobering statements around the current state of the climate. So the level of global warming has now reached about 1.2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial or the so-called natural temperature of the planet. It's not only temperature that's increasing on the average across the globe and of course across all the continents of the world, but it's also extreme weather events that the IPCC has now assessed has already increased in frequency and intensity in every single inhabited part of the world. Such increases in extreme weather events can already be detected. Now, you've mentioned 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming. That is a critical threshold. I'll get to it now, why. But it's known as a threshold where climate change will become irreversible and also more dangerous. And right now, the best estimates that we have is that we are likely to exceed that threshold somewhere in the 2030s. It may actually be the early 2030s or even the late 2020s. So we are on the verge of entering a brand new climate regime where many aspects of climate will be unprecedented or are likely to be unprecedented in terms of what we are used to as humans. Now, first and foremost is the irreversible aspect. That refers to the melting of the world's big ice sheets, specifically the Greenland ice sheet and the West Antarctic ice sheet. It's quite possible, in the case of the Greenland ice sheet, it's likely that the threshold where the melting of that massive ice sheet becomes irreversible is somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. So that's the reason why the United Nations, through the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, and the larger United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, has set 1.5 degrees Celsius as a critical threshold that we really should try not to exceed in terms of the level of global warming. So if the Greenland ice sheet should melt away completely, that means global sea level rise of about 6 meters.
Sure.
The West Antarctic ice sheet is also semi-unstable, more unstable than the East Antarctic ice sheet. And in the West Antarctic ice sheet, where the critical threshold may also be somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius of global warming, there is another 6 meters of potential sea level rise. So we, as the people of today that are making decisions right now, we are going to commit, then quite likely, future generations to sea level rise of 6 to 12 meters. So we will be known as the generation that has stolen living space from future generations. We are literally making the planet smaller. at least in terms of our habitable living space. Now, I should point out that the melting of the ice sheets, that will of course take many centuries, maybe thousands of years, to run their full course. But already in this century, sea level rise is currently on track to reach a level of about 1 meter. That's now compared to the pre-industrial level. We are now, as we are talking today, sitting at about 20 centimeters of sea level rise that has already occurred. It may reach 1 meter by the end of the century, and that will then, during the course of the century, displaces hundreds of millions of people from the world's low-lying coastal areas. So climate change-induced displacements, climate change-induced migrations just because of sea level rise is going to be a huge part of our lives in what remains of this century.
So, I mean, that's almost scary thought processes. Coming back to South Africa, what are the kind of 4 tipping points or implications for us?
So Southern Africa has been identified as a climate change hotspot by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That was back in 2018, when it published a special report on how different parts of the world will be affected when, at that point, when global warming has reached 1.5 degrees Celsius, compared to 2 degrees Celsius and higher levels of global warming. Now, the huge challenge that we have in our region is that it is a naturally dry and warm region, as all Southern Africans will know. It's a region with a highly variable rainfall, strongly influenced by the El Niño-La Niña cycle. Now, the first important aspect of climate change in Southern Africa is that the region is warming drastically. If we look at the temperature data of the last 5 decades or so, we can see that this region in the interior is warming at about twice the global rate of temperature increase. So the world has warmed by about 1.2 degrees Celsius thus far. But here where we are having this discussion today in Johannesburg, temperatures have already risen by more than 2 degrees Celsius. That's now in terms of the average annual temperature. So that's the first aspect of climate change in Southern Africa. It's a drastic rise in temperature. And then there are 2 other aspects that are important. The first is, our region is projected to become generally drier. Now, when a region that is already warm and dry becomes drastically warmer and drier, there's very little that you can do about it. We say that our options for climate change adaptation are greatly limited. And that is first and foremost the reason why our region is now known as one of the world's climate change hotspots. There's another risk we need to be aware of in terms of future rainfall changes, and that is that in the eastern parts of Southern Africa, that includes in our country KwaZulu-Natal, Mpumalanga, the eastern parts of the Limpopo province, and then eastwards and then northwards into Mozambique. This entire region is also likely to more frequently experience extreme rainfall events that may lead to flooding. So it's a challenging future to prepare for, a future that is generally drier, drastically warmer, and despite that general trend of drying, we will also have to cope with more frequent heavy rainfall events. Now, the last thing I should say is that in this region we have a strong so-called El Niño-La Niña cycle. And that just means that we have periods when we are naturally dry and periods during which we receive high amounts of rainfall. And that cycle is intensifying. So another feature of climate change in the region is that during the wet La Niña periods, we'll be even wetter than in the past. And during the dry La Niña years, we'll be even drier. So enhanced variability is another aspect we will have to deal with here in Southern Africa. So this general shift towards a climate system that is drastically warmer and also drier means that we may reach a number of critical thresholds in this region, where the climate regime that we know today will shift into something new. We refer to such changes as tipping points in the climate system. Now, the first of these is the more frequent occurrence of droughts that last for longer than we are used to in terms of the historical record. Already we see the first fingerprints of this type of change occurring in the region. I'm referring, of course, to the 2015 to 17 Cape Town drought.
Day zero, yeah.
The so-called Day Zero drought. And the current drought in the Eastern Cape that is now in some municipalities has been lasting for 7-8 years already, consecutive years of below normal rainfall. What too few South Africans realize is that such a long-lasting drought may also occur further to the north, in the summer rainfall region. It's possible that the Gauteng province of South Africa may experience a Day Zero type drought. All that you need for that, 3 to 6 years of consecutive dryness, where rainfall totals are far below the normal. And that means the levels of the mega dams in the east may fall to below, say, 20%, to the extent that the Vaal Dam's level, the Vaal Dam supplies about 50% of Gauteng's water, falls to below 20%. And that means that we will no longer be able to supply Gauteng's industries with the water they need, or even the households with the water they need for extensive periods of time. And I think we can all think what the consequences of such a drought may be in terms of, firstly in terms of the economy, possibly in terms of social unrest, and we should also think in terms of not only water availability but also water quality. And of course, when the level of the Vaal Dam should fall to below 20%, there will be huge challenges also in terms of water quality. So climate change science tells us the higher the level of global warming becomes, the more likely becomes such a drought in the Gauteng province of South Africa.
Okay, so the drought is the one tipping point.
So there are other really substantial changes that may well occur, that are in fact on the cards for us in a warming climate system. The second important tipping point is the sudden occurrence of unprecedented heat waves. So here I'm talking about periods of prolonged oppressive temperatures. Try to imagine, for example, an event where the temperature in Johannesburg rises to above 40 degrees Celsius for 3 to 5 consecutive days. Such a heat wave has never been experienced before in Johannesburg.
True.
But in the next 10 years, it is already a possibility. And should the level of global warming rise to, say, 2 degrees Celsius globally, and that may currently happen in the 2040s, such a type of heat wave becomes likely in the Highveld regions of South Africa. We can say for a fact that the heat waves of the next 10 years are going to be more intense than anything we've experienced over the last 10 years. And we have millions of people in Southern Africa that are highly vulnerable to such events. I'm here referring, of course, in the first place to people living in informal housing. Of course, they don't have air conditioning, and quite often they don't have easy access to cool water. Now that, of course, colleagues in your own profession tell me is life-threatening, such high temperatures without easy access to cool water. So I think that unfortunately is a clear and present danger in South Africa, and we are completely underestimating the likelihood of such heat waves and also how substantially they will increase in intensity compared to what we are used to.
So that is an important one, because there's so much scientific evidence regarding the problem of high heat in health. There's significant implications related to that.
Absolutely. So the heat-health relationship is of course well known in all mammals, including us. But of course our own bodies have certain thresholds in terms of our own ability to cool our bodies. And we need more research in terms of to what extent those thresholds are exceeded in informal housing in Africa, for example, as opposed to, say, air-conditioned buildings in Japan. So it is not only about biophysical thresholds, but also how these thresholds are determined in terms of the type of dwellings we live in. Another aspect important in South Africa is, of course, outdoor workers, exposed in a future climate to even more intense solar radiation in the context of reduced cloud cover, and also, of course, then in terms of oppressive temperatures during periods of prolonged heat waves.
All right, so droughts and heat waves are the two tipping points. And the other tipping points that you're concerned about?
The third important tipping point is something that may well impact on our food security moving forward. You see, droughts and heat waves in combination have critical impacts on the maize crop in southern Africa and also on the cattle industry. Now, biophysically, if we look at the type of temperatures the maize crop can endure during certain stages in the life cycle of the maize plant, and if we look at the heat stress that cattle that are grazing in the open fields can endure, it turns out that the IPCC made an assessment back in 2018 that 3 degrees Celsius of global warming, which translates to at least 4 degrees Celsius of regional warming, maybe 6 degrees, in areas such as Botswana, implies that our cattle industry and our maize crop may in fact collapse at this level of global warming and the associated much higher levels of regional warming. So remember, it is about the fact that at the same time we are looking at reduced rainfall, reduced quality of grazing, and that occurs then in the combination. These seasons of drought, of course, always occur in combinations with high frequencies of heat waves and heat waves of high intensity. So it's truly a threatening prospect that our entire maize industry and the cattle industry may no longer exist somewhere in the second half of this century. Now that is if we look only at the biophysical impacts of heat on cattle and on this specific crop. But if we start to think about the socio-economics of farming, how many of these 4 or 5 year long droughts can a subsistence farmer live through before he or she have to give up on farming? Even our smaller commercial farmers, I think, in South Africa are struggling to live through a drought that lasts for 3 to 4 years. So quite likely the socioeconomics will imply that that tipping point where the maize crop or the production of maize in southern Africa collapses, or where we can no longer keep cattle in Botswana or Northwest Province or the Northern Cape or Limpopo, those thresholds are probably waiting for us somewhere between 2 and 3 degrees Celsius of global warming, which means it may be as close to us as somewhere within the next 20 years.
I mean, some of these changes we're already seeing in parts of Africa already, isn't it?
Absolutely. So the strong increases in temperature and how it impacts negatively on crop yield and cattle, that has already been observed in large parts of southern and East Africa. For example, during the 2015-16 El Nino, we recorded the strongest heat waves and the highest frequency of heat waves ever in the southern African region. Of course, it was also a summer period of very, very low rainfall totals. Now, during 2015, Botswana lost 20% of its cattle. In 2016, it lost another 20% of its cattle. So that was the first really climate change strengthened El Nino event that then resulted in a very intense drought and intense heat waves in southern Africa. Also, for the summer of 2015-16, the maize crop in the Northwest Province and the Free State Province, in those two provinces combined, the maize crop was about 40% lower than the previous summer. So already the fingerprints of climate change can be seen in our crops, in our crop yield, in cattle production, and unfortunately, as the climate system continues to warm, we will only see stronger and stronger impacts in terms of agricultural production.
All right, and then your fourth tipping point?
The fourth tipping point is something completely different. So, although I think the science tells us that our single most important challenge in southern Africa moving forward is the joint occurrence of long-lasting droughts with heat waves. We should also take note of the fact that we are seeing some warning signals in the eastern parts of southern Africa of a completely different type of risk. And that's, of course, unprecedented flooding. So, what the IPCC has assessed in 2018 in the special report, and that was just confirmed in the recently released Assessment Report 6, is that in a warmer world, it may become possible for the very first time that an intense tropical cyclone, also known as a Category 4 or 5 hurricane, can move as far south as Maputo in southern Africa, maybe even as far south as Richards Bay. Or such a system may move westwards into the Limpopo River Basin between South Africa and Zimbabwe. Now, we've never had a cyclone of that intensity moving that far to the south. We did have a Category 4 hurricane making landfall at Beira. That was back in March 2019, and it turned out to be the worst flood disaster ever in Africa south of the equator. More than 1,000 people lost their lives in the floods and the extreme winds caused by tropical cyclone Idai. But in Beira, at least, the population has some experience in dealing with these types of systems. Why we call it a tipping point is because a system of this intensity would be completely unprecedented as far south as Maputo or even further to the south. Now, a Category 4 hurricane brings sustained winds of about 200 kilometers per hour. If you live in informal housing, it's unsurvivable. Such a system can cause 1,000 millimeters of rain to fall over a period of 2 to 3 days. And then in some cases, it can also cause a so-called storm surge. That is a wall of seawater that forms around the center of the low pressure system and that moves from the ocean inland to the interior. Now, the risks therefore are unheard of in the southern African region, especially the southern parts. We don't have seawalls as they do along the seaboard of the eastern United States or in Japan that can protect us against the worst of the storm surge. In Maputo and in Beira, we are simply not set up to evacuate 500,000 people out of the path of such a storm. And just in our own country, we've recently seen, not from a tropical cyclone, but in fact from a less intense weather system, known as a cut-off low, how vulnerable we are in the eThekwini region. I mean, more than 500 people lost their lives in the Durban floods on 11 and 12 April of this year. Also in South Africa, we are not prepared and we have no tradition of being able of, say, evacuating 10,000 people out of the path of an approaching storm that will cause widespread flooding. So that is the fourth tipping point. We call it a tipping point because it's unprecedented. And for the first time, the climate regime may shift into a mode where such an intense tropical cyclone can make landfall that far to the south. So in terms of climate change adaptation, we have much to do It starts with disaster risk reduction, how to deal with such events when they occur. Usually we should have early warning of a few days before a major heat wave strikes or before a tropical cyclone makes landfall. Seasonal forecasts are really skillful in our region. They can help us to prepare for the next long-lasting drought. But then, of course, across many sectors, and of course that includes the health sector, there's so much more that we should be doing to prepare our most vulnerable communities for these 4 tipping points that, unfortunately, at the rate at which greenhouse gas emissions are currently rising in the atmosphere, are a likely part of our future over the next few decades in Southern Africa.
Thank you, Francois. I mean, the thoughts are almost scary, but I hope the readers of the journal will take this to heart and to say, at least in the health sector, we need to start seriously thinking about mitigating some of these risks and how to plan for them. I thank you once again for coming here for this interview and giving us your thoughts, which I think are highly relevant, and we as a health industry really need to get into the conversation and take part in mitigating the risks to this country. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, Praveen.